Something kept knocking on the trees in a rhythmic pattern, as if trying to communicate. I first noticed it after the forest went quiet in a way that felt intentional. Not the gradual hush of dusk, not the polite retreat of birds and insects as night claims the canopy, but a sudden subtraction, like sound itself had been removed. The cold came with it, a sharp, mineral chill that pressed against my lungs when I breathed, turning each inhale into something brittle. My headlamp cut a narrow tunnel through the trees, illuminating bark slick with moisture and the pale ribs of roots clawing up through the soil. Beyond that cone of light, the forest stood dense and towering, trunks rising so close together they seemed to brace one another against the dark. That was when the knocking began. 3 dull impacts echoed from somewhere to my left. Not loud, measured. Wood against wood, or wood against something harder. Talk, talk, talk. The sound carried oddly, slipping between the trees rather than bouncing back. I stopped walking. My boots sank a fraction deeper into the ground, as if the soil had softened in anticipation. I waited. Nothing followed. No animal crash, no scuttle of retreat. Just the sound of my own breathing, loud and intrusive. I told myself it was a branch loosening in the cold, or a tree settling under its own weight. Forests make noises. I told myself that before, and it had always been enough. I took another step. Talk, talk, talk. This time it came from behind me. The rhythm was identical. The spacing between each knock was precise, evenly measured, as if whoever or whatever was making it had access to a metronome buried deep in the woods. I turned slowly, sweeping my light across trunks that looked identical in their age and height, their bark furrowed and dark like old scars. Nothing moved. The branches overhead were still, locked in an unnatural calm. Even the leaves clinging to the understory shrubs had stopped trembling. Hello! The word sounded wrong in the forest, too shaped, too human. No answer, but the silence that followed felt crowded, thick with attention. I kept moving, slower now, counting my steps without meaning to. 5 paces forward. Talk, talk, talk. Closer. To my right. My skin prickled. I noticed then that the air itself seemed to pulse faintly with each knock, a subtle pressure change that brushed against my ears. The ground vibrated. Not enough to be seen, but enough to be felt through the soles of my boots. A faint answering tremor that rose and fell in time with the sound. I stopped again. The knocking ceased. I waited longer this time, listening past my pulse, past the faint whistle of air through my throat. Somewhere far off, something shifted, a branch bending under weight, or perhaps many branches adjusting at once. The sound was collective, like a body repositioning itself in the dark. When I moved, the forest moved with me. I didn't realize it at first. It was subtle. The way my light caught bark that hadn't been there moments before, or how the path I'd been following seemed to curve differently than I remembered. The trees were too close now. Their trunks leaned inward, not enough to block my way, but enough to suggest a narrowing. A funnel. Talk, talk, talk. Ahead of me, I flinched. The rhythm hadn't changed, but the timing had. The knocks came faster after I froze, as if responding to my hesitation. I took a tentative step forward. Talk, talk, talk. Another step. Silence. The pattern was deliberate. I felt it settle into me with a weight that made my shoulders tense. This wasn't random noise echoing through a hollow. It was call and response. I tested it. 2 steps forward, 1 back. Talk, talk. Only 2 knocks this time, cut short, as if interrupted. The third never came. My breath fogged in front of my face. I could taste damp earth and something metallic like old rainwater. The forest smelled awake. I turned my headlamp off. The darkness rushed in, absolute and immediate. Without the artificial cone of light, the forest felt closer, its presence pressing against my skin. I stood there, blind, listening. Talk. A single knock somewhere very near. The vibration underfoot was stronger now, a low shudder that traveled up my legs. I imagined roots shifting beneath the soil, thick and fibrous, adjusting their grip. I turned the light back on. The trees had moved. Not dramatically, They were simply different. Trunks that had been straight now bent subtly toward me, their upper branches angled like attentive heads. The spaces between them had narrowed further, closing off angles of retreat I could have sworn were open moments ago. The knocking resumed, 3 beats again, but now it came from multiple directions. Left, right, ahead, behind, not overlapping, taking turns as if passing the signal around. I felt seen. The realization crept in slowly, like cold into bone. The rhythm wasn't just repeating, it was adjusting, testing, learning how I reacted, how quickly I moved, how long I waited before stepping again. Each pause I made was answered by a pause of equal length. Each hurried step earned a sharper, closer knock. It was speaking, not in words, but in intervals, in pressure, in the way the forest leaned and settled and tightened around me. A language built from space and sound, from timing and restraint. I tried to leave. The direction I'd come from no longer existed. Where there had been a corridor of open ground, there was now a dense wall of trunks, bark pressed to bark, their surfaces ridged and damp. I pressed my palm against one. It was warmer than the air, faintly vibrating, like a muscle held under tension. Talk, talk, talk. Directly in front of me, I took a step back. The ground hummed in response. A low, resonant thrum that traveled outward, felt more than heard. The branches overhead rustled in unison, a dry whisper that almost, formed a word. I stopped moving. So did the forest. We stood there together, locked in a terrible stillness. I understood then that it wasn't trying to scare me away. It wasn't warning me. It was aligning me, drawing me into the pattern it had been shaping since the first knock. I raised my foot. Talk. I lowered it. Talk. Perfect mirror. My heart pounded out of sync, frantic and human. I forced myself to breathe slower, counting the seconds between each inhale. The forest answered, the knocks spacing themselves to match my rhythm, correcting when I faltered. I don't know how long it went on. Time thinned, stretched between beats. At some point, I realized my steps were no longer my own. I moved when the knocking allowed me to move, paused when it demanded stillness. The trees relaxed as I complied, their branches easing back just enough to let me pass. Deeper, the air grew colder. The vibrations underfoot steadied into a constant pulse, like a buried engine idling. I could sense the pattern now without hearing it, an expectation settling into my muscles. When the knocking stopped entirely, I stopped with it. The silence that followed was not empty. It was complete. I stood in a small clearing I hadn't seen before. The ground here was bare, the soil packed smooth, as if pressed down over a long period of time. The trees around it leaned inward, forming a rough circle. Their bark was scarred with old marks, indentations evenly spaced, running up their trunks in vertical lines. Not scratches, impressions. I understood the last part too late. The pattern wasn't meant to lead me out. It was meant to line me up. Behind me, somewhere in the dense, towering dark, the knocking began again. Slow, deliberate, patient, continuing a rhythm that no longer needed my response to complete it. They realized the forest wasn't empty. Something had been following them since the moment they arrived. The road ended without ceremony, thinning into gravel and then into nothing at all. Evan cut the engine and the sudden quiet pressed in, heavy enough that it felt like a pressure change. The forest rose around the clearing in tall, crowded columns. Fir and cedar packed so close together their upper branches stitched the sky into narrow, jagged seams. Cold air pooled low to the ground, smelling of wet bark and mineral soil. No signal, Mara said, turning her phone once, then again, as if the bars might appear if she found the right angle. The screen remained blank, a pale rectangle of useless light. She slipped it back into her pocket with a shrug that was too casual to be convincing. Told you. Jonah slung his pack over one shoulder and stepped out of the car. Gravel crunched under his boots, the sound sharp and loud in the stillness. That's the point, right? Off the grid. He grinned, but his eyes kept flicking toward the tree line, following the way the shadows pooled between trunks. Couple days, no distractions. Evan locked the car and pocketed the keys. The click echoed farther than it should have, ricocheting through the trees until it thinned into something like a distant knock. He frowned, listening. When nothing followed, he shook it off. The trailhead marker was old, the wood bleached and splintered, the lettering softened by decades of weather. Beyond it, the path narrowed quickly, swallowed by undergrowth. Ferns brushed their legs as they walked, cold with dew. The light dimmed with every step, the canopy above thickening until the sky was just a suggestion. At first, the forest felt empty in the way remote places often do, quiet but not hostile. Their footsteps were the only movement, their voices the only sound. They joked, pointed out odd-shaped roots, the way moss climbed one side of the trunks as if reaching. It was an hour in when Mara stopped. "Do you hear that?" she asked. They stood still. The forest held its breath. No birds, no insects. Even the faint rush of wind through the high branches had faded, leaving a silence so complete it rang in Evan's ears. "I don't hear anything," Jonah said. "That's what I mean." They waited. The silence stretched, taut as wire. Evan felt it then, a sensation like being observed, not from a single point but from everywhere at once. He shifted his weight, the ground soft beneath his boot, and the feeling eased just enough for him to doubt it. "Probably just a lull," he said. "It happens." They kept going. The trail began to change. Not dramatically, not in any way Evan could point to, but it no longer felt like the same line they'd been following. The curves were sharper. The ground sloped differently. A fallen log they were sure they'd passed earlier appeared again. Its bark split in the same distinctive way. "Didn't we already?" Jonah started, then stopped, frowning. "Never mind." By late afternoon, the cold had deepened. Their breath fogged faintly as they walked, each exhale briefly visible before being swallowed by the darkening air. Shadows shifted at the edges of Evan's vision, not moving so much as rearranging themselves when he wasn't looking directly at them. They made camp near a stream that murmured softly, the sound oddly muffled, as if the water were flowing under a layer of cloth. The clearing was small, hemmed in by trees that leaned inward, their branches overlapping overhead. Felt enclosed, sheltered, or watched. As they worked, Evan became aware of a rhythm beneath the usual noises. Not a sound exactly, but a pattern, a subtle repetition in the way branches creaked, in how often the wind stirred the leaves. It took him a moment to realize it matched the timing of their movements. When Jonah knelt to set up the stove, the forest settled. When Mara stood, the leaves rustled. He said nothing. Night fell quickly. The darkness between the trees thickened until their headlamps seemed to illuminate less than they should. The beams swallowed after only a few feet. They ate in near silence, the small clink of utensils sounding intrusive. "Okay," Mara said finally, her voice low. "I'm probably imagining this, but does it feel like we're not alone?" Jonah snorted softly. "It's a forest." "I know. She gestured vaguely. "From the start. Like when we got out of the car." Evan looked at her. The memory surfaced unbidden. The way the sound of the car door had echoed, the sense that something had answered. "I felt it too," he admitted. They sat with that, the stream whispering nearby. The forest did not react to their confession. If anything, it seemed to relax, the branches settling into new positions, the shadows knitting themselves tighter around the clearing. That night, Evan woke to the sound of footsteps. They were soft, careful, circling the edge of camp. He lay still, listening past the rush of blood in his ears. The steps paused whenever he held his breath, resumed when he exhaled. He thought of calling out, of waking the others, but something held him back, a sense that drawing attention would be a mistake. When morning came, pale and gray, the footprints were gone. The ground around the tents was smooth, the soil pressed flat as if nothing had disturbed it. "We should leave," Mara said, not bothering to lower her voice. Jonah nodded immediately. "Yeah." They packed quickly. The trail they took out was not the trail they'd come in on. It was narrower, the trees closer, their trunks scarred with old marks that Evan couldn't quite focus on without feeling dizzy. The air hummed faintly, a low vibration that traveled up through his legs with each step. At some point, Jonah fell behind. "Just a second," he called, his voice oddly distant. Evan and Mara stopped, turning back. Jonah stood a few paces away, staring at the trees to his left. "What?" Mara asked. "I thought I heard." He trailed off, shaking his head. "Never mind. Go ahead." They did. The path straightened, then forked without warning. The left branch was darker, the trees there leaning closer together. The right was lighter, more open. "Which way?" Evan asked. Mara looked from one to the other, then back at Jonah. He wasn't there. They called his name. The forest swallowed the sound. No answer came back, but something shifted, branches creaking, the ground vibrating in a slow, steady pulse. Mara took a step toward the darker path. Evan grabbed her arm. "No." She looked at him, eyes wide. "It knows," she whispered. "It's been with us since we arrived." The forest seemed to listen. Behind them, the lighter path narrowed, the trees adjusting, closing ranks. Ahead, the darker path waited, open and patient. Mara stepped forward again. This time, Evan didn't stop her. As she moved, the forest changed, branches easing, the vibration smoothing into a welcoming hum. Evan felt the shift like a weight lifting, like a choice being made. The last thing he heard before the trees closed between them was the sound of footsteps falling into perfect time with Mara's own.